I don't think I need to tell you guys I love Resident Evil. At this point, I feel like that is a well-established fact, but now that I've got no new RE titles to cover, you might be wondering what the hell I'm going to do with myself, and truth be told, I was kind of wondering that too. Well, hypothetically, what if there were a Resident Evil-like game that existed in ancient Japan? One that maybe achieved an amazing level of fun with its melee-based combat, but still stuck close to those survival horror elements that made me fall in love with RE in the first place. Of course, if such a hypothetical series were to actually exist, I would be almost obligated to cover it, right? Well, friends, I'd like to introduce you to the start of something I think is going to be fun as hell. Everyone, welcome to the Onimusha. You know what, actually, given the context, I think we need to change that up a little bit. Minasan Onimusha Retrospective e Yokoso.
強い者だけがのさばりやがって。
In what seems to be a running trend with Capcom titles, Onimusha has a pretty damn interesting story behind its development. Back in the latter part of the 90s, Capcom was just starting to hit a nice little bump in its popularity with their Resident Evil series, and as a consequence, a lot of people around the office started dreaming up ways they could slap their own brand of creativity on the promising series. One such pitch was Sengoku Biohazard, an RE spin-off with the goal of transplanting that classic survival horror style into Japan's ancient past, an idea that I have to admit is pretty damn genius when you think about it. The plan was to have the gameplay people found so fun in Biohazard and have it all take place in a huge Japanese manor filled with traps and biomutated enemies, much like the Spencer Mansion. Now, as amazing of an idea this clearly was, the higher-ups at Capcom decided to make it its own thing and strap the title of Onimusha on the RE spin-off, and in an odd twist, we actually have footage of a version of that idea that made it to at least some level of completion. As you can see, the footage of the still-in-development PS1 build of Onimusha was surprisingly close to what we would end up getting on the PS2, but man, a part of me still wishes this would have been my intro to the series. You guys know I'm an unapologetic PS1 fanboy, and that combined with the cool idea of RE's recognizable gameplay lying underneath the amazing exterior of samurais fighting demons in ancient Japan, well, that sounds like a dream come true for me. Sadly, we may never actually see the inner workings of this original PS1 build for ourselves, but on the plus side, it seems to have migrated onto the PS2 with most of what was shown in the video still being on offer, so I'll take my wins where I can get them. The story of Onimusha Warlords is relatively simple, especially in comparison to the convoluted mess of canons I'm used to in the RE universe. The game starts with our hero Samanosuke Akechi keeping an eye on a roaring battlefield until he ends up participating in it after he's attacked. Turns out this was a fight between Nobunaga Oda and Imagawa Yoshimoto, and even though Oda came out as the victor, well, let's just say his singing career is going to be on hold for a little bit. With Oda assumed dead, rightly so, things in Japan go back to normal, that is to say constant bloody skirmishes between warlords. But outside of that, Samanosuke gets a letter from his cousin, Princess Yuki, letting him know that there have been some strange disappearances and she believes some kind of monsters are responsible. So our ponytailed hero shows up to see what all this is about, but it appears he's just a bit too late. In looking for his royal cousin, Samanosuke gets his ass stomped by what's called a genma, which is basically a fancy word for a demon. In his defeat, Samanosuke is visited by the Oni clan and given the power to defeat the Genma threat and a gauntlet which will seal their souls away. Now that he actually has the power to do something about this otherworldly threat, Samanosuke happens upon this absolute looker of a Genma named Guildenstern, who lets him know the Genma are in the process of resurrecting Nobunaga Oda with the goal of having him usher in a new demonic age here on Earth. And this is our general setup. Throughout the game, you will come across little side goals like rescuing a kid Yuki started taking care of, but mostly it's just Samanosuke and his ninja partner in crime Kaide looking to both rescue Yuki and ensure Nobunaga doesn't rise from the grave and conquer Japan. As the game proceeds, this will be the biggest driving force, but much like the series that inspired it, Onimusha has a lot of background lore to deliver. Mostly you'll get this through records left behind by people who have come into contact with the Genma and tried to research them, as well as guards and servants in Onimusha Castle who likely fell to the demon invasion. And yeah, you did hear me right, at one point dead bodies scattered around the palace will start talking to you. I felt like this was the perfect match of depth versus simplicity. For the person only looking to engage with the gameplay, there is just enough story delivered through cutscenes to keep the experience driving forward without feeling pointless, and if you enjoy this sort of historically accurate Japanese world, there's all kinds of stuff just waiting to be discovered under the surface. There's a lot of history to be found between both the Genma and the Oni, and I love a tale that takes something fantastical like a demon invasion and brings it into a realistic setting like ancient Japan. In your common RE game, you'll find a nice balance of story, pacing, and gameplay, the goal being to encourage the player to explore the location around them while every once in a while giving them some kind of Skinner box-like push to keep them progressing forward. And here in Onimusha, you'll find the same formula at play. Onimusha Castle is a pretty big place with lots of backtracking and survival horror-style gameplay to engage in, but if the game doesn't step in and enforce the player's forward momentum, some people might get bored. In that sense, Onimusha is incredibly well paced, although that may be because it's also a relatively short experience. Or I guess I should say it's about average for a Capcom survival horror game. The voice acting here I can comfortably say is okay. It's not really so bad you can make jokes about it, and not so good that it'll surprise anyone. There are going to be a few standout performances, but I think you'll find less than stellar writing gets in the way a lot of the time. With the Japanese dialogue option turned on, Samanosuke's voice work is actually done by the real-life Japanese actor who serves as his face model, more on that later, and I think overall the Japanese voice cast is much more true to their on-screen avatars. In my opinion, Onimusha does a great job of presenting the tip of its narrative iceberg and allowing those who are intrigued to dive in a little deeper so they can get a better look at it. This isn't exactly the furthest reaching or most deep story I've come across, but it supplies a really interesting tale that brings a lot of Japanese folklore into a realistic period piece set in an actual point in the country's history. A lot of the more out there elements like demonic hordes and stuff are played straight, which is something I always enjoy, and overall this was a great little story. It set up a cool world and even allowed a lot of openings for future titles to jump off from. For the weebs out there, I'm sure the concept of a Resident Evil story, but with all the bio-experiments and pharmaceutical malpractice elements replaced with Japanese ghost stories, that's gonna be an automatic sell, but for the rest of you, I can safely recommend this game based on its story alone. It's not super long, but there's something to be said about a story that doesn't wear out its welcome. And for those of you who somehow still need convincing, samurais, fighting demons with magic swords. Enough said. I feel like describing Onimusha's gameplay is pretty damn easy. I mean, take everything you did in RE1 and give Chris or Jill a big-ass katana and you basically got it, which is exactly as cool as it sounds. In all seriousness though, there's a lot more on offer here than you would expect from a mere RE clone, but I think we should probably cover some familiar ground before we get into that. Like the first Resident Evil title and all of the good ones, Onimusha gives you a large estate to explore and even includes a sort of underground lab type of element for good measure. Samanosuke navigates this castle in a very RE manner by finding key items, unlocking doors, and solving puzzles, so no new innovations there. But there are a few twists on the classic formula that we will most certainly talk about later. Instead of a mostly projectile-based approach, Samanosuke is going to be engaging in close quarters combat for a majority of the game, and the good news on that front is, this is no RE knife fighting. Movement in and out of battle is fast and incredibly responsive, with a lot of mobility options becoming available by hitting the right trigger to lock onto a specific enemy. When you have your sword readied, you can sidestep, backdash, and modify your attacks with directional inputs. Hitting forward an attack will get you a forward lunge, and back will have you doing a pretty useful kick. It doesn't deal much damage, but the kick deals a hard knockdown, which leads into another incredibly useful mechanic. Once an enemy hits the floor, you're able to finish them with a nice downward stab, and I'm being genuine when I say this is one of the most satisfying things you can do in a video game. It's not exactly a one-sided benefit, since enemies can still attack you while you're performing this animation and it takes a long time to finish, but that's what good crowd control's for, right? Speaking of which, during combat you may need a little something extra to give you that edge, and in Onimusha it comes in the form of magic attacks which are unique to the weapon you're using. Each one has a different effect and specific use case, like a long-range firebomb, close-up melee combo, and wide-reaching AoE. These magic attacks are great for pulling you out of the frying pan when you find yourself surrounded or stuck in a stun loop. Oh, and I should probably mention Onimusha has some killer boss encounters which will really test your combat and mobility skills, plus a tower climbing challenge mode we'll cover in a bit. Without a doubt, I can say Onimusha's combat is far more technically challenging and mechanically engaging than anything you'll find in even the most action-heavy Resident Evil title, and yeah, that does hurt a bit to say. Most of the time with an RE game, the point is to avoid combat whenever possible because the only reward you get for taking an enemy down is that enemy no longer being a threat. But here in Onimusha, it's a little different. Each Genma you slice in half releases souls that can be absorbed by your gauntlet, and this is a pretty versatile little mechanic. Red souls act like experience points that can be used to upgrade your weapons, magic attack, healing items, and long-range ammo, while yellow and white souls refill your HP and MP meters respectively. Since you most definitely have a very real incentive to grind, the game continues to spawn enemies long after you've cleared an area, and to be honest, I'm not exactly sure how this works. Sometimes it seems like I just need to clear a room a few times before it no longer spawns enemies, but sometimes they respawn anyway, so who knows. Truth be told, if you enjoy the fights in this game as much as I did, you'll probably have maxed your weapons and magic out by the 65% mark, and at that point, the only reason to engage in combat is to bask in the glory of how much of a killing machine you become. Getting back to an earlier point, partway through the game you can enter a sort of tower climbing arena mode that sees you engaging in a series of increasingly tougher combat challenges, and this is a great little way to sidetrack yourself. The reward for making it to the 20th floor of this tower is an item that'll unlock a special kick-ass sword at the very end of the game, which, to be honest, feels like a bit of a raw deal. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's nice basically breaking the last boss fight, but it's a little lame not being able to take this sword into a new playthrough and absolutely dominate as a reward for your hard work. Now, you might argue that this would make the game a cakewalk, and that leads me to my next point. Onimusha is kind of a cakewalk, or at least most of it is. I'd say a relatively average gamer would be able to get through a large portion of the game before ever needing to use their first healing item, and I think that mostly has to do with the fact that the game is pretty likely to deal out health restoring yellow souls when you need them most. So counterintuitively, if you find yourself low on HP, going out and getting into a fight may be your best option. Usually I'd say I cleared the game with at least 8 of the strongest healing items in my inventory, and as my streams have made abundantly clear, I'm no master at playing video games, so I gotta assume a lot of you guys will do much better. Now that may sound like bad news. After all, a game with no challenge isn't exactly appealing, but let me assure you, Onimusha hits its stride around the 75% mark. At this point, stronger enemy variants get introduced and the game definitely stops pulling its punches. After this, it's not uncommon to find yourself cornered and taking constant damage by enemies whose attacks all seem to link up perfectly with your hit stun, meaning you'll get passed around until you're lucky enough for their rhythm to get interrupted or you use a magic attack. I'd say this is when things really start to get interesting, and I would love to see a selectable harder difficulty, but believe me when I say one of the game's ports more than makes up for this. One thing that both sets Onimusha apart from most games and can easily be missed if you're not looking for it is the Isen system. This is basically a fast one-hit kill that can be activated by hitting attack just before an enemy attack lands. And let me make one thing very, very clear. You have never, and I mean never, experienced something so damn satisfying in a video game before than one of these Isen attacks. This will definitely be something you'll want to practice since the game has you countering much later than it feels like you should, but there is a trick to it. You want to wait for the enemy slash to reach its apex, which will only give you a few frames to attack on, and I'll be really honest here, I'm not the best at taking advantage of this when I get stressed out. When things start to get hot and heavy in combat, trust me, a majority of my Isens come from pure luck and not finely tuned skill. There is a second form of this that can be done by blocking just before an enemy attack lands and following that up with a well-timed hit, but I almost never pull this off, or at least not as much as the other one. This is a great little risk-reward type of mechanic that allows you to put your HP bar on the line for the possibility of getting more souls, but honestly, you can get souls from doing anything. Realistically, you're only doing this because it looks and feels so damn cool. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about something interesting that just sort of came to me while I was capturing footage for this video. Like I mentioned before, the game has you collecting elemental weapons and leveling them up with souls collected from combat. Well, it sort of dawned on me that this little mechanic plays more into a Metroidvania game than a survival horror title. In a Metroidvania, the environment isn't opened up by keys, but instead with abilities. Collecting a new offensive or mobility option will allow access to an area that might have previously been unreachable. In Metroid, you could use the Morph Ball as an example. Without this, it would be impossible to progress any further than this point. And on Onimusha's end, this plays out in the form of doors that not only require a specific weapon to open, but for that weapon to be at a certain level. For me, this feels like the marrying of two incredibly similar genres, and I would absolutely love to see more series take this kind of a mixture to their gameplay. Now you not only have an incentive to grind in the form of improving your overall combat effectiveness, but also to progress further in the game. Now it's important to mention this could have easily gone the other way. If the game's combat wasn't so damn fun and satisfying to engage with, having so many elements outright requiring constant fighting would have seemed like an absolute kick in the balls. Luckily, they crafted an amazingly fun combat system and included multiple elements in the game that supported it. Very well done, Capcom. Speaking of well done, there are these puzzle boxes scattered around with numeric locks where numbers need to be aligned in order with only a certain amount of turns being allowed. And don't ask me why, but for some reason I just connected with these things on a crazy level. There just seems to be something about this task that resonates with me where even after more than a few failures, I'm still really excited to jump back in and figure out the right series of moves. For most of the game, like you might imagine, you'll see things from Samanosuke's point of view, but in a few instances you'll take control of his partner in crime, Kaide. Since she wasn't visited by the Oni, you start off doing almost no damage to the Genma, but eventually she does come across an item that has the power to inflict real damage to enemies, but even then she isn't able to absorb souls, so really there's no point in fighting anything you don't absolutely have to. That being said, you might want to anyways. She's so satisfyingly fast and her moveset is just divine. Without a doubt, I wish we would have seen a Kaide only New Game Plus or something. Now, I've basically been blowing this game so far, and for good reason. It's amazingly fun and an absolute treat for survival horror fans who also fancy a touch of Devil May Cry in their RE. But that certainly doesn't mean it's without downsides. Like I said before, it could be argued that a majority of the game is too damn easy. If you've completed it even once, it's likely you'll go through a large portion without ever needing to actively heal. And yeah, it's no fun getting beat against a rock that is a game's difficulty, but I'd argue one being too easy is just as frustrating. And totally contradicting what I just said, there's one area that's pretty universally panned for being a little too ridiculous. Early in the game, there's a gauntlet of 3 consecutive puzzles, and 2 of them, while not the hardest things in the world to figure out, are instant kills if you mess them up. Of course, these puzzles can totally be overcome with just a little perseverance, but after they kill you, you're forced to sit through both a cutscene and the first easier but more time-consuming puzzle. And while the second one can be figured out with a little patience, the third and final one is set to a strict timer, which sort of forces you to be really frantic with it. Let me put it this way, you're gonna die on this your first try, I'm almost positive. This section of the game is nowhere near what I would call broken, but when the rest of it has so much purposeful amount of polish, it can stand out as being a little less well thought out. Another possible complaint a new player may have is the game can be incredibly short, but to be fair, if you're used to playing RE-style games, this won't exactly be a new concept for you. And on top of that, there are ways to lengthen your first playthrough with collectibles and the tower challenge, so it's sort of a wash. Even taking into account the scant amount of downsides I was able to come up with, I'd still say the first Onimusha title is one hell of a tightly designed package. In its short runtime, it's packed full of an amazing amount of fun gameplay, but mostly it's content a survival horror fan will be looking for, which is always awesome for me. The puzzles can be super challenging, but straddle that thin line between being tough and totally solvable. The combat is so damn satisfying, I'm genuinely surprised we haven't seen any real imitators of the series, and the exploration is going to feel like a comfortable old sweater for RE fans. In my opinion, this is a total home run. Onimusha takes everything the fan base has always loved about classic Resident Evil, and it improved on the one thing a lot of people seem to agree was its only failing, the combat. It may be a short flash in the pan, but a game being so fun that you're a little upset when it's over isn't exactly the worst problem you could have. If by some random chance you're watching this video and have never picked up Onimusha Warlords, I would say your next move should be to immediately remedy that. It's one of those rare perfect storms that you really don't see too often in the medium, and you're doing yourself a disservice every second that goes by without you experiencing it for yourself. In fact, I think this weird caterpillar guy said it best.
生きて帰れる保証はねえけどよ。なんでもそれなりの褒美が手に入るって話だ。
Alright, so now we're getting into the good stuff. Onimusha, being an early PS2 game, only offers interlaced video output, and I did try to force progressive scan with GSM, but no luck, so it looks like we're left with 480i as our only option. Back in the day, this would mean using the FrameMeister to capture my footage, since in my opinion, the Meister offered the best deinterlacing method, but the emphasis there is on the past tense. I say that because Mike Chi has recently released his magnum opus in the form of the RetroTink 5X, a line multiplier offering a much higher resolution output than the Meister and my beloved motion adaptive deinterlacing. Now, if nothing I just said makes any kind of sense whatsoever to you, well, count yourself lucky. It all pretty much adds up to I was able to get a really nice looking 1440p image out of an actual PS2. In fact, I had actually captured everything I needed for this video long before finishing this script, back when I used the OSSC for 480p and the Meister for 480i, but as soon as the Tink 5X got worked into my setup, I knew I had to re-record everything using it. Which I'm really glad I did. The FrameMeister has definitely served me well, but one undeniable downside has always been its noisy video output, a problem I thankfully don't need to deal with anymore. Moving on to the actual game we're supposed to be talking about, Onimusha looks absolutely stunning for such an early release in the PS2's life. The pre-rendered backgrounds are probably some of the best looking I've ever seen, and some of them animate at what seems to be 60 frames per second. With old PS1 survival horror games, the issue most people had was that the low-poly 3D characters on screen would often stand out like sore thumbs against the 2D backgrounds, but here it seems like a bump up in resolution was all that was needed to remedy that issue. The entire picture just seems so much more cohesive, kind of like the 2D and 3D assets are so close in their overall look that they mesh together perfectly. Taking technical prowess out of the equation, the artistry of how incredible some of these shots are just blows my mind. I mean, look at this damn game and try to keep in mind it was released on the same console that once housed the infamous Charlie's Angels. Capcom certainly knows their way around designing great 2D environments in their games, but the CG animation in the cutscenes is also worthy of praise. The game does seem a little darker than I remember, but it's not so dark that it degrades the picture or anything, just something I thought I'd take note of. Of course, you absolutely can't talk about Onimusha's 3D graphics without broaching the amazing job Capcom did at translating Japanese actor Takeshi Kanashiro's likeness to the game. They went to great lengths to make sure this was a convincing capture, and in my opinion, they absolutely nailed it. As the series and the technology they used progressed, they got better at this, but if you ask me, this was one hell of a first shot. Coming from a very RE background, these guys obviously knew how to put some good gory monsters on screen, and that is exactly what the Genma are. I found nearly all the demonic enemies in the game to be really cool looking, but I am partial to these skeleton-like grunts. You can probably blame this on my inner teenager, but there's just something about a visible ribcage and skulls that still does it for me. On top of looking good technically, I'd say Onimusha takes a few artistic chances, like making a horror game bright and colorful, and if you ask me, this was the right move. I mean, on one hand, you are trying to portray a horrific scene, but that scene is taking place in ancient Japan, and that sort of requires a different approach. Everywhere you look in the game, you'll find bright popping colors, and even the hit effects during combat seem to have that arcadey flashiness to them. Magic attacks appropriately light up the screen with a similar approach, and overall I would say this might be one of the most interesting looks I've ever seen in a horror game. Since we're using the motion adaptive deinterlacing here, you might notice that 3D objects in motion will blur slightly, and that's basically the process catching up to the on-screen movement. Now don't get me wrong, I still think this is the best way to display interlaced content on modern flat panel displays, but sadly we haven't reached a point where the process is perfect. But hey, the OSSC Pro is supposed to be right around the corner, so who knows what the future holds. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Onimusha Warlords looks incredible, not only for its time, but I'd argue it still holds up today. But you guys know my favorite part about making these full series retrospectives is getting real deep into a game's many ports, and in this case there is a lot to cover, so let's jump down this rabbit hole. First up, we have one of the most interesting ports I've come across in a very long time. Not happy with a simple re-release, Capcom wanted something a little different for the planned Xbox port of Onimusha, and I'd say different is a key word to focus on here, because in a lot of ways this is a totally new game. First, and most obviously when you boot the game up, Genma Onimusha received a hefty increase in the difficulty. Honestly, I'd wager even veterans of the original stand a pretty good chance of getting wiped in the first 20 minutes of this version. At the very start of the game, you'll find yourself running into late game enemies, and they hit way harder than you might remember. My first time with this port years ago, I had no idea they made such insane tweaks to the difficulty, so I just sort of assumed I'd forgotten how hard the original was. But trust me when I say that a lot of the reason I think the first PS2 release is so easy comes from the dramatic increase in toughness this time around. On top of a much harder playthrough, fans of the original will find a sort of arranged mode going on here. Items are in different locations than you might be used to, and some doors are open with totally different keys. For example, the very start of the game in the original has you picking up a rope ladder from the room where you obtain your first weapon, while Genma Onimusha has you bypassing this totally and instead passing through this door, which is supposed to be locked until the mid-game, to grab the same ladder at the bottom of this well. Throughout the game, you'll notice small tweaks like this to item placement and event orders, and they really do liven up the experience when, like me, you're going straight from one to the other. If it's been a while since you last played the PS2 original though, you're a little less likely to even notice things have been changed at all. Oh, and by the way, when I say they upped the difficulty, I'm not just talking about damage output and HP values being tweaked. Puzzle boxes have also received a nice little bump up in challenge, with them getting additional rows and columns, and I think this makes them even more fun. Speaking of fun, this version of the game has some all new enemies to go up against, which do add a satisfying amount of challenge to the normal combat, but there is one exception. These dolls right here. I want you to get real familiar with them because if you're planning on tackling this port, they are going to haunt your every waking moment. These absolute abominations track you from room to room, are immune to normal attacks, making them nearly impossible to kill in the early game, and can deal massive amounts of damage. If I were you, I'd just run whenever you hear that little bell chime because you'll need a fully upgraded MP bar and you'll have to drain every single magic attack from all three of your weapons to get the job done. Trust me, it is not worth it. Speaking of normal attacks, to help deal with the increased challenge, this version of the game has a new charge attack that actually fits into gameplay really well, and a system that has you grabbing new green souls that'll let you go invincible if you get enough of them. Now, I imagine this was added to help mitigate some of the new challenge, but in reality it makes the game so much harder. See, you're not the only one who can get their hands on these souls, and if an enemy catches you with a counter, well, you can lose the ones you've collected. So now you not only have to work crowd control on a room full of demons, which is enough of a challenge on its own, but if you knock a green soul out of one of them, you need to hammer on the soul collect button so another demon doesn't get a hold of it and level up his damage output and moveset. Keeping on track with the additions, a whole new challenge mode has been added to the main game. Right here, where in the original sandbags used to block the way, you'll find a new area leading to a gauntlet-style tower mode, which in the end allows you to acquire this kick-ass armor set. Now, I'm going to warn you ahead of time, this is a grueling challenge, and while I've gotten the armor on the game's normal difficulty in the past, I found the last fight against the possessed armor to be too damn frustrating this time around. So I started a new game on easy just to obtain the armor so I could show it on screen, because apparently having a YouTube channel turns you into a masochist. Speaking of armor, Genma Onimusha has whole new armor sets that can be found throughout the regular game, and these look cool as hell too. With the massive amounts of additional content, you would assume this would be the definitive edition to play if you're looking to try Onimusha out, but the absolutely brutal difficulty makes this more of a content-rich New Game Plus for players already well familiar with the base game. I mean, sure, you can unlock easy mode by dying a bunch, which new players absolutely will do in the first 40 minutes or so, but even on easy, this game far outdoes the original in toughness. And on top of that, a lot of the new stuff here sort of requires knowledge of the original release to really appreciate. For example, the difference in item layouts and new paths won't do much for someone new to the game, and the ability to skip cutscenes seems tailor-made for returning Onimusha fans already well acquainted with its story. So if you find yourself bored with the ease of the PS2 release and really want to test your skill, this is going to be an absolute blast for you. But if you've yet to master your East encounters and you're not looking forward to getting wiped by the very first enemies introduced in the game, well, maybe stick with the original. Of course, there may be some of you out there without the ability to even hook your PS2 up to your new flat panel display, or maybe you just don't want to deal with 480i in 2021, but you're also not looking to drop $300 on a line multiplier. Well, Capcom's got you guys covered too. The Onimusha Warlords HD remaster hit the scene in 2019, and as far as remasters go, I'd say it's pretty bare bones. There really isn't any new stuff to speak of, but realistically, all any of us were ever looking for was an easy way to play Onimusha in HD, and in that sense, this is an absolute winner. It takes the amazing looking graphics of the original Onimusha and displays them in 1080p, and really you can't ask for too much more than that. Just like Capcom's previous remasters, there is a 16:9 display option, but I found this zoomed in way too far for my taste. On the plus side, the backgrounds don't seem to suffer too much in this mode like they did with RE1's remaster, but it just felt like I was losing a lot of vertical real estate, so if I were you, I'd give the 4x3 mode a try first. Seeing these pre-rendered environments upscaled is really damn cool, and it's clear they spent way more time cleaning these images up than the work they did on RE1's remaster. Call me crazy, I still sort of prefer the alias look of the PS2 or Xbox versions on the Tink 5X. In a really dumb, admittedly kind of stupid continuing theme for me, I just wish they would have upscaled the original game's sprite-based font so that we could have a more authentic look. But if I'm being honest, this new text is nowhere near terrible looking. What is though is how much smaller it is than the original, leaving a lot of open space in the inventory screen that used to be occupied by actual text. Really and truly though, I'd say the one thing about this remaster you could legitimately complain about might also be one of its best features. It's just Onimusha Warlords. There aren't any added bells or whistles to it, more or less. It simply is the original game in HD. But I will say the one big addition they did implement really improves the gameplay. In the original, you had to go into your menu every time you wanted to change your weapons, not only for combat, but also to open doors locked with these elemental ball things. Here in the remaster though, a simple touch of a shoulder button will cycle through both your melee weapons and long-range options. This very small addition really spruced things up for me, and if you're thinking about jumping into this game but you don't really want to have to get used to what might be an older approach to game design, this improvement might make the remaster your best bet. If you do happen to already be a fan of the original, there is one issue you might want to be aware of. Remember that guy who composed this great little ditty? You know, the one who claimed to be deaf but was proven a fraud later on. Well, he also, and massive air quotes here, composed Onimusha's original soundtrack, and I guess for legal reasons they weren't able to use his work for this re-release. At first I was a little upset by this decision since it's a pretty damn iconic OST, but after learning it was a legal necessity, well, I guess there are worse problems to have. Speaking of problems, this remaster does introduce at least a few of its own. Sometimes the game will autosave while you're in the middle of fighting, and in a game where you're trying to encounter enemies with a 3-frame reaction window, well, a few dropped or skipped frames can really suck. On the plus side though, this is the much easier PS2 version, so don't expect this to ruin a playthrough or anything. As an unexpected side effect of softening the pre-rendered backgrounds, the extra sharp 3D models tend to really stand out in that same way early PS1 RE games would. Now that's not exactly a huge issue for me, but I would most definitely prefer the more aliased but natural look of the PS2 and Xbox originals. If you ask me, there isn't much more you could expect from a remaster than accurately representing the original in a higher fidelity with a few bugs squashed. And in that sense, this is one hell of a remaster. Nothing extra, no bells or whistles, just the kick-ass gameplay you're used to in an HD package. And having said all that, the question of which one to go with starts to creep in, and in this one situation I would say each version of Onimusha will appeal to different crowds. Fans of the original that know it back to front will definitely want to look into the supreme challenge that is Genma Onimusha, and those of you not willing to ditch more modern HD visuals, well, you're going to want the remaster. Personally, and I know this is going to surprise no one, I'm still sort of partial to that PS2 original, but I would totally understand if you want to go with one of the other versions over it. There's not really a bad choice you can make here, and since you know I love doing this, let's get the 3 major players up here side by side. As you can see, the PS2 version definitely has the softer picture at its native 480i, but a modern scaler or line multiplier will take care of that problem for you no issue. The Xbox's gorgeous 480p output is nothing short of amazing looking, and if you do happen to have analog connectors on your modern TV, you'll find 480p is treated far better by the internal scalers built into most TVs than 480i is. The HD remaster looks about on par with other PS2 HD conversions and comes with a very accurate picture when set to 4:3. You may run into a different soundtrack and a few issues with these sharp 3D models clashing with the softer 2D environments, but I imagine that there are plenty of you watching who will be fine with that if it means getting HD visuals. And if that is the case, hey, more power to you. With no doubt in my mind, I can confidently say that Onimusha Warlords is one of the best titles to ever hit the PS2, and something that survival horror fans will be able to fall right into with no worries. On the opposite side of the coin, if you've ever played an RE game but put it down because the combat wasn't to your taste, well, maybe this will be the perfect middle ground for you. And hey, if it ends up turning you on to the typical RE playstyle in the process, well, that's just icing on the cake. If you've made it this far into the video and haven't been convinced yet, let me make this very clear. You need to play this game. It is fun as all hell, and all while combining genres that most people would assume would make poor bedfellows. It's one hell of an experience, and the short runtime means you won't have to clear your schedule to try it out. Flat out, games like Onimusha just do not get made anymore in the AAA gaming space. It took chances on toying with an established formula and in turn created something totally new. Plus, and let's be clear, this is the real draw: Resident Evil and ancient Japan. Need I say more? Well guys, I appreciate you jumping on this new journey with me, and here's hoping I see all of you again when we go over the sequel to Onimusha that I used to not like very much. Emphasis on the used to. But that's a story for next time. Until then, minasan, arigatou gozaimasu. Hey guys, thanks for spending a bit of time with me today. If you're into content like this, I'll have some more stuff you'll get into linked here on screen, along with work from Martini, the amazing artist who drew today's video thumbnail. If you enjoyed this little project, do me a favor and give them some love. Their work is top notch. Well guys, have a good one, and I will see all of you next time.